One day he went off. He went to about 250 or 300 feet. He never had a great pitch, good enough for where I was hawking. One day he went off to a pitch in quite a blustery, windy day. Came down, missed the partridge in the covey that I had flushed completely, and then continued to harry it.
Hey, how's it going, everyone? Welcome back for the next episode of the Falconry Told podcast, and what is now the 8th episode of our international series featuring falconers from the UK. And without a couple of key people, this series wouldn't have been able to take place. And those two people are Simon Tyers, who is also the author of the Specialist Falcon, and Neil Davies, who is the editor of Pursuit Falconry magazine. And if you haven't had a chance to check out these great publications yet, I highly recommend you do so. If you want a copy of the Specialist Falcon, head to thespecialistfalcon.com, and you can also get autographed copies from Simon from that website as well. It's a great modern book on long winging especially, and is a good source of information using a lot of modern technology as well. So if you haven't got your copy yet, I highly recommend you do so. And if you want to go and subscribe to Pursuit Falconry magazine, head to pursuitfalconry.co.uk, and you can subscribe there. There's always tons of great information and content in each new issue. So if you haven't yet, I highly recommend you do that as well. And we're down to the last couple episodes that were recorded at the Valley Expo before we moved on and recorded at other locations, but this was a very busy weekend, and the second to last person here that I recorded at the Valley Expo was Gordon Mellor. And Gordon is also the chairman for the Hawk Board, and we kind of discussed some aspects of that as well as his personal falconry. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to the conversation with Gordon Mellor. Here we go. It's been a great weekend, and I mean, how's it been for you so far?
Yeah, I've really enjoyed this weekend. I mean, it's because it's the first one of its type here. It's certainly had its teething problems, and it's been a little bit bitty, I think, but it has shown what is possible. A really exciting event. Equally, there's been some really good falconers and really interesting people here, which means it's a pleasure to spend a couple of days in this part of the world.
Yeah, no, it's been great, and I've been very humbled by a lot of people's, I guess, willingness and kind of just excitedness, if you will, to kind of be willing to share some of their stories and experiences with us. And no, it's been great on my end so far too. I've really enjoyed my time here so far. People are like, how you enjoy England? I'm like, well, the one strip of road that I've been down so far, it seems really swell. But I mean, I'm sure I'll see more this week. But anyway,
yeah, and indeed, you're not far from the hawking grounds of the old hawking club, and and other sort of rook hawking venues from our past. Not that they are used anymore really extensively for falconry, but this part of the world, and just a little further east, is really important for British falconry.
Cool. So there's a lot of history and a lot of heritage around this area then overall.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. I mean, Roger Upton, a former president of ours and a long-standing grouse hawker, flew rooks and crows here in the 50s and 60s. Of course, it was more open then. There's been a lot of tree planting since, which to a long winger is, of course, a real shame, but nonetheless. And so this area has a strong history, and of course, further towards Wiltshire, the old hawking club, of course, rode after peregrines flown at rooks and that was their major form of the sport. When the area became fenced, that actually killed the mounted pursuit of falcons chasing rooks, and that in turn led to the end of the club. That's how it was important. So the old Hawking Club actually ceased largely because their ground actually became untenable for the sort of falconry that they practiced.
That's interesting. Yeah, no, like I said, I want to touch a little bit more. I definitely want to touch more on some of the history surrounding this area, and you being the former president of your respective club and whatnot. I definitely want to hear a lot about just the evolution of how things were then versus now, and if you could go just kind of start with that.
Yes, certainly. I mean, falconry, of course, from its sort of medieval origins, actually became, and I know we now use this term as to characterize horse racing, but it became the sort of sport of kings, the sport of the elite, and was highly, highly socially significant up till about the 1660s or whatever. Then it started to go into decline, partially because of the enclosure of open land, and partially because times had changed. The advent of the firelock, the predecessor to the shotgun, meant that it was easier, but also it was easier to hunt with what we now can consider a firearm. But it was also, it just lost its tenure in terms of the social elite and the way they lived their lives. And so it went into something of a decline. There were one or two really, really significant figures who tried to keep it going. Colonel Thornton, Lord Orford, and what have you. And they had at the sort of end of the sort of 17 and early 1800s, they had a determining effect, and so it was always practiced. It didn't die out. It never became extinct in Britain, but it became far rarer, and there were small groups of falconers who sometimes banded together in clubs and what have you. It struggled through the sort of the 19th century, but then the old Hawking Club actually took up the mantle, and as I described just a few moments ago, they flew in this part of the world passage peregrines at rooks and some crows, but passage peregrines at rooks and crows. Game hawking was popular, but not as big a club event as was that very social event of riding after peregrines at rooks. And they, as I described earlier, sort of came to an end when mounted falconry stopped being possible. You just couldn't, the advent of barbed wire was a nightmare for anybody on a horse, never mind a falconer on a horse. So it was something that saw the end of the formal old Hawking Club. Wasn't helped by, of course, the First World War, which saw a number of potentially very good falconers, of course, fall in conflict in France, and so it went through a little bit of a hiatus. The British Falconers Club comes out of the demise of the old Hawking Club. Now, again, it was reasonably elite, not perhaps as elite as it had been a couple of hundred years before, but it was often the military, a little bit of the landed gentry, those who had easy access to land, who flew, and comparatively small numbers. The British Falconers Club was very quite known and sometimes still considered elitist. It isn't at all now, in my view. But so falconry rumbled along. The likes of Stephen Frank and Roger Upton really reinvented grouse hawking on the moors of Yorkshire further north, and some in Derbyshire, but in Scotland. And they reinvented that in the 50s and 60s. It having really fallen into such decline as I think one could consider it had been practiced very, very little previously. Because Roger Upton was put in touch with some falconers from the Gulf, from the Middle East, there began a relationship which had hitherto not been very strong. So there was a relationship with the Gulf states, which, when we went through the 60s and 70s, facilitated a small import of hawks from abroad that when you couldn't, after the peregrine decline, due to DDT in the environment, you couldn't get domestic peregrines. And so that was kept alive by that. Then we get to, it was a small, fairly elite activity, but becoming more, it's not quite the right word to use, but it was becoming more democratic about the time I started. And I got my first hawk when I was at boarding school, and the gardener used to let me keep it loose in one of his gardening huts over the summer vacation, and I used to fly this little kestrel, which had one leg. It had been pointed out to me that there was a kestrel screaming in a kestrel nest, one sort of late spring. I had climbed the tree, being interested in birds of prey. I had climbed the tree, found this kestrel. It had a broken leg. How a broken leg happens in a nest, I do not know. But I took it. I thought, well, obviously, I'm a schoolboy. I don't have any wherewithal to take this to a vet, and I don't think any vets in those days really would have known what to do with it. So I splinted and bound this leg. A bit too tight. The leg went black and fell off, so I had a one-legged kestrel. However, that kestrel was, became very tame, flew wonderfully, never caught anything. A little Eurasian kestrel. They're not greatly predatory in a captive state, but, and I started with that. I had become interested in birds of prey because in years before that, when I lived in Malaysia, my father was in the military. My father gave me a book, and it had a watercolor painting in it of an Arab falconer, an Arab with a saker on his fist, and he was standing in front of a racing camel with a saluki, and I had that book open on my bedside table for years. Unfortunately, I have no recollection where that book has gone, but that was my first interest in birds of prey. It was this picture of an Arab with a saker falcon. So I'd been interested. I had got lucky. I don't know that the one-legged kestrel thought it was lucky, but I got lucky by getting that bird of prey, and that started me. I then became a pain for one or two local falconers, and I was forever knocking on their door, and how do you do this? How do you do that? Where can I get a hawk from? I flew some sparrow hawks. That with varying success, and then a member of the British Falconers Club, and this is a very long time ago now, gave me an old goshawk, and I flew that old goshawk for a couple of years, and I thought, I am a proper falconer. I went then, I think, to the second Woodhall Spa, and realized I wasn't such a proper falconer at all. I saw some very good falcons flown, and but I also saw people sort of struggling along just like me, which sort of opened the door to me thinking, well, I can do this, and so that was important. I have always flown. Very rarely have I ventured to the moors of the north. I have always flown lowland game. Or a lowland form of rook hawking. When I was younger and fitter, I would fly not as falconry predecessors, mounted on a horse, but I would fly at rooks and crows on foot and run miles. And I was fitter, and I could do it then. I can't do that anymore. I'm no longer in that sort of condition. But my hawking was composed around that sort of rook hawking and a little bit of game hawking on lowland ground. Not ideal, not nearly as open as some of the ground we have here, but not ideal. But it has been the mainstay of my falconry. And that was what I did. I was by that time going regularly to what was the Eastern Region British Falconers Club meetings, and the chairman of the Eastern Region in the 1990, or I think it's about 1990, might have been 1991, said to me, "Will you become the Eastern Region rep?" Which meant travelling to council meetings, which were held in the Midlands, about 3 or 4 times a year. I did. I got on to the BFC Council, and apart from a short spell of about 2 years, I've been on the BFC Council ever since. I'm coming to the end of my tenure, and there will be many people who will smile and think about time too. He's done it too long. But in that time, I was an Eastern Region rep. I became our very first conservation officer. I then became I think, let me think. I took up another role. I can't remember what it was. I then, in the early 2000s, there was a little bit of a hiatus in the club. I stood and was elected president. I stood on the basis that I would only do it for one term. It was not an ambition of mine. I just felt the club needed to go through some changes, and I could not persuade anybody else to do it. However, I won that election. I went in, served my term as president. In that term, I had made contact with a gentleman I've mentioned previously, a very important figure in British falconry, Roger Upton. Roger was such an important figure that it was something of something missing from the BFC, the British Falconers Club's CV, that he had never played a prominent part. So I spoke to Roger, who was a reasonably elderly gentleman at that point, and said I felt that he would be ideally placed to become president of the BFC, and I was happy at the end of my 3-year term to hand over to Roger Upton. And I think the club, and this sounds very self-serving and I apologise for that, but I think the club is better for that move. And Roger was a good president for us. It's subsequently handed on to a different president who has done his spell and will be standing down this autumn. And we have another, very, very well respected senior falconer who will take over the British Falconers Club from him. To bore you further, I became in the early 2000s involved with the Hawk Board that had been set up in the British by the government, actually by the Home Office, as the advisory panel for captive hawks at around the time that there was going to be legislative change around keeping birds of prey. And so I became a member of the Hawk Board, a body that represents British falconers and captive bird of prey keepers, is not a governing body. It is just a representative body. It has its detractors. People either love it or hate it or don't think at all about it. But I've been on Hawk Board for most of the time since. I'm obviously drawn towards falconry politics, if you can use that in the broadest sense. So, I have been on Hawk Board since. I have for the last sort of, I think 7, maybe even 8 years, been the chairman of the Hawk Board, and I will do another term. And I say this with some regret. I was going to stand down because I do believe that everybody has their sell-by date, and it would be good to have fresh blood and in post. I was going to stand down, but there were very few takers. It is the Hawk Board itself is a fairly thankless task, and I and some of my colleagues are obviously suckers for punishment. But we are involved in representing falconry particularly, but other hawk keeping sort of activities, including breeding, pest control, and the like, with the government. We are consulted regularly, sometimes more than others, but we're consulted over legislative changes and what have you. We've had some successes, we've had some failures, as with any engagement with government. We comparatively recently were hijacked in Scotland, and the blue hare, the mountain hare, was removed from a quarry list. It doesn't look like we will get that back. That's very, very disturbing from a falconry perspective. Having a game species removed from one's grip is something that is regrettable, and we are not used to. So that was a major blow. But we have had other successes. We have defended falconry quite vigorously. There is an ongoing, and has been evident for the last, I think probably for the last 10 or 12 years, ongoing tightening of our legislation. But we have been consulted very recently about wild take, which is very unusual in the UK, taking birds from the wild for falconry, but it is still on the statute book. I've got a feeling our government might like to remove it from the statute book. We have been consulted, and we are fighting very hard to have it left. I don't think there's much case. There's a lot of captive breeding, and there's a good number of captive or domestically bred falcons available, peregrines particularly available. There is no reason to think we need to take from the wild. But we don't want it removed from the statute book, the ability to apply for a license, because we don't know what the situation is going to be like in 10 or 20 years' time. So we're working currently, that's ongoing, we're working very hard on that. Of course, in British terms, we've been hit quite hard by avian influenza, which is evidently now endemic in the wild bird population in the UK. And that has caused some restriction. I do, however, believe, now this is not Hawk Board policy, but it is my belief, that falconers have to get on and fly their hawks. We have to go out and fly our hawks. Yes, we need to take good biosecurity measures. Yes, we need to be careful and not perhaps hawk in the vicinity of major poultry sort of concerns, but we need to get out and practice our falconry, because our falconry will die by default if we keep the hawks inside and just wait for things like avian influenza to leave our environment. So yeah, we're at an interesting point. We've got, and I can now say this because I'm old, we've got as good a falconers now as I think I have ever seen. A really high, a sort of a high-performing group of some young people who fly their hawks and falcons to a really high standard. We should be very proud of those. Of course, we have a much wider footprint, and some sort of hobbyists who really do need upskilling. But I think we see that everywhere. But I think British falconry is in a good state at the moment. Yes, there are concerns about flying non-native and hybrid species, and there are always things that we can do better. But in actual fact, some of the events or some of the achievements of British falconers have been quite extraordinary. Of which this event here at Fowley, the falcon racing and the falcons at the Row Crow, the automated quarry, they are an aspect of our sport. However, it is all orientated towards what falconry is, which is a hunting activity. And it's that hunting activity that both motivates British falconers, and ultimately, I believe that we are the best at. So I'm not saying that we're best at nationally. I mean, that's what we are looking to achieve, is good quality traditional falconry. I'm not making any judgment about falconry elsewhere, so things are good. Things are good here. We're under pressure with quarry numbers. We're under pressure with legislation. We're under pressure in terms of the public's perception of welfare. But we have a lot going for us, and falconry is in a good state. It's in we have some practitioners who, and some people who I'd give my right arm to be as good as. So I'm very proud of what has been achieved.
Great. Well, yeah, I mean, any place that has any kind of hunting period is always going to face some degree of negative perception or pushback, or it's just the times that we live in. I mean, all we can continue to do is just try and put things out there in as positive light as we can. And it does always help having some group. I mean, who the group is and who it's made of is always subject to change, and is also another matter of debate, and always will be amongst said hunting communities. However, yeah, I mean, if you don't have anybody advocating for you, and you don't have some kind of united front to plead your case to the other powers that be, then yeah, things eventually just get swept under the rug, or you get pushed aside. And yeah, I mean, it's I don't want to see that any more than you do anywhere. Yeah. So.
No, I absolutely agree. And, I always say when it comes to the likes of the BFC and the Hawk Board, if they were to fold, falconers would reinvent them, because the need is evident. I don't much mind who runs them, what they're called, and what have you. I would just like falconers to contribute, to have their voices heard, and to work for the sport of falconry, which has brought me so much and so much pleasure. And I've met some wonderful people. Even though, as I think I said to you earlier, that most of my hawking is done between me and a falcon. It's not done with anybody else. But I've met some wonderful falconers and some really good falconer conservationists. We've got a lot to offer, and we keep having to fight our corner.
Yeah, well, and there's nothing wrong with wanting to keep your falconry to yourself. I mean, there's lots of guys that I know that's kind of like their personal shrine or whatever, and they don't really. I mean, that's just not their thing, and that's perfectly fine. But everybody's got to figure out what works for them. But going back to that, I mean, refresh my memory again. Which region of the country did you say you were from?
I am on the very edge of the eastern region, which is East Anglia, and it's the. If you look at a map of England, it's the bumpy out bit just above London. It juts out into what we call the North Sea. So I'm part of, officially I'm part of the eastern region, but I'm right on I'm right on the edge of that. So I'm on the Beds-Bucks border, the Bedfordshire-Buckinghamshire border, in mixed open countryside. But it has suited me, and it's close enough to where I work, where I earn my living. That means that as a working falconer, I can actually, practice several days a week. In busy periods, perhaps I'm only out 2 days a week. In less busy periods, I'll be out 3 days a week. Plus, using the weekends makes, certainly my brand of long wing falconry practical.
Cool. Well, I mean, what exactly is it in your region, or what's kind of been the primary prey species that you continue to hunt? Right.
Well, historically, in the eastern region, apart from partridge and pheasant, but historically it was heron. It was in the old days. It was heron. Of course, we don't do that. We don't do that anymore. They're entirely protected. But it's game hawking is the key. There's a little bit of rook hawking there, not very much, but game hawking, and some very, very fine practitioners. Some people who have devoted their lives to performance at game, and so partridge and pheasant hawking has been really what it's about there.
Gotcha. Well, out of curiosity, then, I mean, I've asked a couple of these other guys that I've talked to over the weekend, kind of what hunting for them looks like, because the terrain, to some degree, in some areas, might be similar to us in the U.S., but some of your prey species are going to be a little different, but what's the approach and for you and with the types of birds that you hunt with? And
right, I am in recent years I have sort of confined myself to small peregrines. I have a female Barbary falcon at the moment and a Brookii tiercel, so a small subspecies of the peregrine. And because I don't hunt pheasant, I hunt partridge, what you might call Huns, but I hunt partridge, and I would have to say, regrettably, their numbers are in what looks like terminal decline. But yes, it's mixed country. You obviously, because of the way we're set up, you have to have permission from the landowner to hunt in the UK, and so I can't hunt wherever I see partridge. I have to hunt on particular sections of land. And interestingly enough, grey partridge have become so scarce that I've recently lost a farm that I've hunted on for 20 odd years, because the farmer became aware that the partridge, and this was not deliberate on my part, but I had just always referred to them as partridge. He became aware that they were grey partridge, not Frenchman, not red-legged partridge, which are mostly released for shooting. Grey partridge are the traditional partridge. He was so excited about having grey partridge, I lost my hawking ground because he didn't want anybody to touch them. I can't blame him. I regret losing it. It was a lovely beat of land, but so you go out, you go to where you have permission, and you sit. The way I work it, I do not run a dog for lowland for lowland game hawking. I sit and scan, look for signs of the partridge. If you don't get them, but you know the ground well and you know where they're likely to be, sometimes you walk and wait to bump them, to put them up and what have you. And then you try and get a flight. I fly one hawk at a time, and I don't mean a cast. I only ever have one hawk in training at a time. So I fly my one hawk. It gets one flight. Hopefully it kills something. If it doesn't, it is called in and we go home. And that's the way I sustain my hawking. If I took too much off the ground, there wouldn't be anything there to hunt. So I have to eke out my small partridge and declining, as I've already said, declining partridge numbers, eke out for a whole season by being quite careful with them. So as I say, one flight, one kill or otherwise, but is the staple. And I fly perhaps 4, occasionally 5 days a week.
Well, I mean, anybody that can, it seems like these days, anybody that can manage to hunt more than 2 or 3 times a week, it seems to become more of a luxury in a world where we have to continue to work
Yeah.
and keep busy schedules and stuff. But over the years, I know that your land access, like you said, is mostly privatized, and you've always had those kind of hurdles to deal with. And was there a time that before though where it was easier, or was it?
Yeah. Certainly, it is becoming more and more difficult to persuade landowners to allow you onto their land. Undoubtedly, and more difficult in a sort of sense that it's not necessarily that it's anything to do with falconers, it's to do with people on the land. There's a good deal of pressure on land for walkers and stuff like that. We have sort of quite endemic in some areas, what is now illegal coursing of hares on land. So the response from landowners, and I'm not criticizing it, it's just an observation, the response from landowners has been, no, just, don't come. And of course, the amount of British countryside that you can actually wander onto without permission is comparatively little. So it is becoming, I'm very glad that I am now fairly old and I have, the most of my hawking is behind me, because I'd hate to be starting out now. It is tough. For young falconers to get ground to hawk over.
I'm sure. Yeah. I think that's pretty much true for everywhere. I've discussed it many times before, but I mean, we lose, I mean, even in places where you have like public lands and things that we have even, I mean, we lose more and more spots every year to development and construction as well and other stuff. So, but kind of going back some then to your role and your responsibilities for the political side of things, which, all the power to you. Any kind of politics is not for me. I try my best to stay out of them, but or not be the subject of them or otherwise, like most people. But all that being said, kind of discuss a little bit more then about were you involved in a lot of the transitional process from whenever you used to be able to do more wild take before as opposed to now where almost everything is captive bred obtained? Or
I have certainly, I mean, since the early 90s, I've been involved in what I perhaps broadly call falconry politics. Most of that, I would have to say, is inward looking. It's looking at the falconry fraternity. It's explaining, educating, and trying to promote the legal context in which falconry has to exist, largely because it is tempting, and it is tempting for young and new falconers, perhaps with a different view of authority, to think, I'll do what I want. The damage in a smallish country like the UK can be immense if people just go off piste, as it were, and do whatever they see fit. And so a lot of falconry is trying to get the best out of our practitioners. Then, of course, the next step is dealing with our legislators, and that is increasingly, I think you've already acknowledged, we're increasingly in the spotlight. The areas that we operate in are increasingly confined, and it is one of those things that you just, is just a time of where we are in this point in history. I would love to see it to turn about, but I think we get small victories that we must celebrate. We also get some reverses because things are getting tighter, particularly in an overcrowded small island. We had a good deal of hope that leaving the European Union for Brexit, and I'm not becoming overly political here, I would have to say I was a Remainer, not a Brexiteer, but leaving the European Union through the process of Brexit, we had thought would free us up from some quite difficult European legislation. The reality has not been that at all. It's been really very sad to see that the reality has been that we are perhaps now as regulated, perhaps more so in some respects, than some of our European colleagues. Some European falconers are able to come over in the grouse season and go to the moors in Scotland, and have been able to work that even with very difficult transport legislation and what have you. Almost no British falconers are able to travel to continental Europe to fly there. Somehow it says to me that we've got the whole process of Brexit the wrong way around, but so be it. Yeah, so it is, I observe that, I'm not, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not overly motivated by legislation. What has kept me both interested and motivated, sometimes not motivated, but kept me mostly motivated in falconry politics, is it's really about people. It's dealing with people. And it's dealing with people who share an interest, a passion of mine. We often see it in very different ways, and you will know very well that falconers can be damning about each other, but we all do share that same passion. Now, it's beyond me to unite falconers without a shadow of a doubt, but I do believe that where I can contribute, I should. I owe that to my sport. I owe that to those who are going to come after me. And so that's what's kept me involved. I mean, it has driven me nuts. I once had a full head of hair that I no longer have. But, it is something that I deem as important. Many very, very fine falconers would die rather than become involved in falconry politics, and good on them. More power to their elbow. But, it's what I can contribute, and it's what I'm happy to do. So at least for the next few years, the next 3 or 4 years, I do have to step out. I do have to start thinking, well, I'm no longer a young man. I want to do just what I want to do. I don't want to take time out during the hawking season to be traveling across the country to meet with people. I no longer want to be sitting in front of our legislators, arguing the point when I know that most of them are not interested and are not very receptive to our position. So there's a whole bunch of things which are negatives. Do I regret it? Not one bit. I am both very proud sounds too strong a word. I am very pleased to have been able to play a small part in the protection of our sport. And if future generations look back on that, well, good. If they don't, also good. It's not going to affect me.
Yeah, no, it's not like you're doing it for praise or glory. You're just doing it because you feel like it's just a personal passion or responsibility. Yeah.
That's right. That's right. And it is something that there a lot of people think, being president of the British Falconers Club is a very big deal. It's only as big a deal as you make it. It really is only what you can contribute to the club. Being chairman of the Hawk Board, yes, it carries a little bit of kudos, but only for those who think the Hawk Board's worth having, and there's many who don't. But I will, for my own, from my own perspective, I will speak to anybody. I will listen to anybody. I don't always agree, but and I am happy to go and represent falconry. And people may say, yes, through my lens, the falconry that I think we need to defend. But that is fairly mainstream, and I'm happy to do that. So that has been that. I go back, and as we've already discussed, I go back, and during the season I fly my hawk on my own. During the week I have some successes and some failures. I've already said I have two falcons at home. Occasionally in the past I've had a few more, but I've never been a big falcon owner. They're only worth owning from my perspective if you can use them in your falconry. I'm not a hawk collector, as it were. And I did have a little dabble in breeding, in the early 2000s, and bred successfully some peregrine barberries, very small number. I stopped that very soon because it became fairly evident that that I was a little bit of a haphazard breeder, really. It was backyard breeding, and it was something that other people do very much better. I have recently reviewed for the British Falconers Club Journal Nick Fox's new version of Understanding the Bird of Prey, and it made me smile when I read, and of course I had read the first edition, but when I read this new edition, it made me smile to think how meticulous and carefully planned and well understood his breeding was, which is of course why he has been a significant breeder, and how very much sort of hit and hope mine was. So it did make me laugh about those efforts. I won't go there. There's quite enough peregrines being bred to allow me to have hawks to fly for the rest of my falconry career. I do not need to breed, but it did make me smile at how I thought at the time I was doing a wonderful job. I think some of the successful breeders now would think we need to take this person under our wing and teach him how it's done.
Well, I think that there's always somebody that's going to think that about other people. It's to some extent or another. I mean, there's always seems like there's always those in every aspect of life that thinks that you should be doing things their way, But that's neither here nor there. But well, I guess this would be a good time to do our usual ask of. I mean, is there a particular memory, a particular,
bird, a particular hunt that always will stick out in your mind as like one of your favorite experiences? Or
Yeah. Oh, I mean, yes. I mean, I regularly sort of have my top 10 flights, and I think they change with the weather, you know. But yes, I did. I was fortunate enough. Although most of my success has been with peregrines, I was fortunate enough to fly a little socially imprinted prairie tiercel some years ago. I socially imprinted him myself. I did not breed him, but I socially imprinted him myself. And to my regret, he only lasted about 2 months. He killed himself by diving into a pond on a late November morning and died of cold shock. That said, that little tiercel provided me with more unadulterated joy in the couple of months I hunted with him. I flew him a few weeks, nearly a month before he was ready for hunting. He was a magnificent hunter, just a magnificent hunter for someone with, and I say this, you know, I don't think my fieldcraft is bad, but it is not as good as some people's fieldcraft. That hawk was the most forgiving long wing I have ever flown, and after partridge, which I started him at, he took, and of course I won't go into any details, he took a good deal of other quarry species. He was not wedded to partridge, but he was aimed at partridge. And one day he went off. He went to about 250 or 300 feet. He never had a great pitch, good enough for where I was hawking. One day he went off to a pitch in quite a blustery, windy day, came down, missed the partridge in the covey that I had flushed completely, and then continued to harry it by going back to 50 or 60 feet and stooping again. And they went round, and this is just fortuitous, they actually did a large arc, which means it actually, the flight was never very far away from me, and I saw more direct hunting in that flight than I might see in a whole season, because it was never more than about 50 or 60 yards away, and eventually he took the quarry, he took the partridge, and what have you, probably from a stoop, from 70 feet or so, not great. Some people would have considered that a rat hunt. I considered it just a really quality flight, because that hawk was so tenacious. He did not give up. He didn't make contact with the first stoop, and that hawk then flew for, I should think, a couple of minutes more before he eventually knocked the partridge down. And I will carry that to my grave. The sort of the unadulterated joy with which, when I went to pick up this little prairie. Funnily enough, I've tried several prairies since and never had anywhere near that success. But my goodness me, I loved him. And of course, he did dive in. I think after a moorhen, he dived into a pond on my ground on a very cold late November morning, and that was that. I couldn't get him back to the car and get him warmed up in time.
Yeah, a prairie, especially a tiercel prairie, is another bird species that I will try and fly again. Yeah. Eventually, I had one a few years back that I was super close to getting ready to hunt, and was doing very well, and then all of a sudden overnight just died of an infection that it was not it was asymptomatic with, but that was a rare bird, and that my wife even liked that bird. Wow. And so I mean, like that, I let's just say whenever you talk about that prairie in that respect, then yes, I understand. Whenever you put all this work in, and I had that bird as kind of a late pulled eyas, and kind of did the same type of deal. Spent 4 months getting him, ready to go and whatever. And then all of a sudden, it's just over.
Yeah.
And so I get it. At least you had 2 months of decent hunting with yours. I was so close to getting to the point where I was ready to start doing the real thing. And then, so, but,
to quote Shakespeare, violent delights have violent ends, don't they?
Yeah, that's a good saying for sure. But, well, I mean, so as far as, I mentioned the pearls of wisdom thing to you, or the, is there anything, a piece of advice, any kind of, I don't know, words of wisdom, anything you'd like to pass on to other generations, or?
Right. And talking specifically about individual hawks and falcons, I believe that modern falconers give up, particularly where there is easy access to others. I think we give up too soon. And so I would say to falconers, actually work harder and work longer on a falcon before you discard it. We hear too often, oh, this one's not very good. Or, I'm going to get something else because this one won't do. I believe that most of them will. Not all, but most of them will do what we want if we get the triggers right. So I would just say to falconers, work harder on these individual hawks and falcons because they can produce it. Don't give up and just go out next year and buy another one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's good advice. And there are so many people who have told me that long wings especially can take sometimes years to fully mature and realize their potential. Yeah. And I mean, I think if you're someone sometimes that, I don't know, is apt to a little bit less patience and maybe a different species might work better. I mean, there's some guys that I know that, there's a reason they fly accipiters and goshawks and things like that for a reason, because you can tell pretty quick if one of those is gonna turn out to be an avid hunter or not. But no, I think that's a good piece of advice. And I mean, if anyone wants to learn any more about the board or any other aspects of how they can get involved in some of the more political advocacy side of things in regards to your region, I mean, where can they go to find more about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, the British Falconers Club has a good social media presence, and the office is manned by a professional secretary who. So the British Falconers Club are easy to contact. The same applies for the Hawk Board. We're well publicised and what have you. And believe you me, if anybody wants to contribute, I will welcome them with open arms, because it is getting people, and I absolutely understand why. It's not for everybody. It's obviously suited me, but it's not for everybody. But I absolutely understand that other people want to do other things. But if anybody thought, I want to give a little bit back, or I want to, I could actually do that. I could bring this to discussion or represent my sport with DEFRA, the government department. There are plenty of avenues to do that. And we are not exclusive. We are, this is very much meritocratic. It is not something that, you have to have been born with a silver spoon in your mouth to do, and we have some people who would both support, and indeed we have in the Hawk Board, we have a couple of very promising young new members who will take up their positions this autumn. Who will be what we call elected specialists, so the ones who do the donkey work. We have some really good potential there, but people need to come forward. Falconers need to come forward. Equally, we liaise across the world through IAF and through NAFA and through the Middle East Falconry clubs. Falconry is a pretty big family. We're pretty good. I mean, we have lots of differences, don't get me wrong, but we're pretty good at when the chips are down, we do support each other. And of course, we feed off the expertise of the whole fraternity of falconry, the whole family, not just our national entity.
Well, I think it's very well said. And I mean, like I said, I appreciate you taking the time, sitting here in the swelteringly hot, whatever.
It is a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, for those listening, we've had to make the best of what we got as far as arrangements over the weekend, and I've been recording most of these in a very hot. I don't know. You could almost call it a solarium. I don't know, but it is what it is. But I mean, thank you for taking the time and kind of going a little bit more in depth about yourself and sharing some of your stories. And it's been nice getting to know you over this weekend.
Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. And let's go not be hot anymore.
Absolutely.